Hello, I'm Kelly Pratt. Welcome to the Monroe Minute. Did you know that December 2nd marks the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine? What is the Monroe Doctrine, you ask? Well, let me tell you a little bit about it. James Monroe, the fifth President of the United States, included what would be called the Monroe Doctrine in his annual message to Congress on December 2nd, 1823. At that time, Latin American colonies had just gained their independence, but Spain wanted to reassert control over them. Additionally, Europeans were interfering in Florida and the Pacific Northwest, causing the American government much concern. The British government thought that European involvement in South America and the United States would impede their ability to trade. Britain proposed that the U.S. issue a bilateral policy condemning European efforts to colonize in the Americas. The Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, thought that Britain might have ulterior motives. Adams, along with other cabinet members, worked with Monroe to issue a unilateral policy which resulted in the Monroe Doctrine. Here are the main points of the Monroe Doctrine. The United States would not interfere in European affairs. The United States recognized and would not interfere with existing European colonies in the Americas. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. And if a European power tried to interfere with any nation in the Americas, that would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. The Monroe Doctrine created separate spheres of influence for the U.S. and European countries. It discouraged Europe from interfering with the Western Hemisphere, as this was now the United States' sphere of influence. While the policy was a strong political statement to the world, in 1823, the U.S. lacked the military might to back up their statements. There were several instances where Britain interfered in the Americas and the U.S. did nothing to oppose them. One instance where the U.S. did intervene was the Venezuela boundary dispute in 1895. During a boundary dispute between Venezuela and the colony of British Guyana, Venezuela called on the U.S. for help, citing the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. arbitrated the years-long dispute peacefully, and both Venezuela and Britain agreed to the results of the arbitration in 1899. In 1902, British, German, and Italian gunboats blockaded Venezuela's ports because the Venezuelan government defaulted on its debts to foreign bondholders. This action resulted in the Roosevelt Corollary, which President Theodore Roosevelt issued on December of 1904. The Roosevelt Corollary expanded on ideas of the Monroe Doctrine to create a new vision of the United States as an international police power. While the Monroe Doctrine was used to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, the Roosevelt Corollary gave the U.S. permission to intervene throughout the Western Hemisphere. Unfortunately, Roosevelt and other presidents distorted the points in the Monroe Doctrine for their own benefit. This misapplication of the Monroe Doctrine allowed the U.S. to interfere in Latin America in ways which had negative impacts on Latin American countries. This has sometimes resulted in strained relationships between the United States and Latin American countries. The aftermath of World War I and World War II transformed the United States into a global superpower, shaping its foreign policy based on principles akin to the Monroe Doctrine, emphasizing self-determination, non-colonization, and regional security. The Cold War further solidified these principles, with the U.S. adopting containment policies, mirroring the Monroe Doctrine's aim to prevent external influences in the Western Hemisphere. Commitment to defending the Western Hemisphere, preserving independent political systems, and promoting regional security were shared goals, reflecting a continuity in U.S. foreign policy influenced by the Monroe Doctrine's principles. One of the more well-known uses of the Monroe Doctrine, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, was a pivotal event during the Cold War. At this time, the United States and the Soviet Union were on the brink of nuclear conflict over Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba. President Kennedy announced that it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. The crisis invoked the Monroe Doctrine's principles as the U.S. asserted its commitment to preventing external threats in the Western Hemisphere, leading to a tense standoff that ultimately resulted in the removal of the missiles and reinforced the doctrine's relevance in U.S. foreign policy. During the Cold War, U.S. interventions in Latin America, such as the Cuban Revolution and the Bay of Pigs, were often influenced by the principles of the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine's emphasis on preventing external influences and maintaining regional stability allied with the U.S. goal of containing communism and maintaining influence in the Western Hemisphere. However, post-Cold War changes in U.S. policy in Latin America marked a shift toward the principles of the Monroe Doctrine by emphasizing diplomacy, economic cooperation, and support for democracy. This transition reflected a desire to uphold the doctrine's core principles of non-intervention, sovereignty, and regional peace, while fostering constructive relationships with Latin American nations. In the modern era, the Monroe Doctrine has encountered criticism from Latin American countries, particularly regarding perceived neo-colonial implications, with concerns about sovereignty, economic dependency, and human rights. However, the doctrine remains relevant in addressing contemporary global challenges. When applied correctly, it can be used to address counterterrorism, to promote fair trade and economic relations, to address climate change, and to advocate for human rights and democracy. The doctrine's core principles of regional stability, non-intervention, and cooperation provide a framework to tackle a range of contemporary issues while respecting the sovereignty and autonomy of Latin American nations. For 200 years after its proclamation, the Monroe Doctrine has left a profound and lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy, particularly in shaping relations between the Americas and the rest of the world. It articulated a vision of non-intervention and regional stability that has influenced U.S. interactions with its neighbors for nearly 2 centuries. This historical policy provides a lens through which we can understand the complexities of international relations and the importance of historical context in shaping global policies. It underscores the need to appreciate the nuances and evolving dynamics of diplomacy as the world's geopolitical landscape continues to change. As we reflect on the Monroe Doctrine's legacy, we are reminded of the vital role history plays in shaping the course of nations and the relationships between them. Understanding the context of past policies can provide insights into the challenges and opportunities we face on the global stage today. Well, we wish the Monroe Doctrine a happy 200th anniversary. Thank you for joining me on this Monroe Minute. Bye.